Under the bright sun, the transport ship touched down on the sandy field of the new base. The engines roared once more before shutting off, leaving only the low hum of distant machinery. He stepped out, his boots sinking slightly into the hot ground, scanning the horizon where rows of armored vehicles and training soldiers stretched into the distance. The air smelled faintly of fuel and dust, a mix that told him this was a place where work never stopped. He walked toward the main command tent, passing clusters of soldiers who paused their conversations to glance at him. Some nodded in greeting, while others simply watched, curiosity in their eyes. It wasn't every day that someone new arrived from another front. His duffel bag felt heavy on his shoulder, but the weight of the unknown was heavier still. Inside the tent, a tall officer with a stern face stood behind a table covered in maps and mission reports. The officer studied him for a moment, before sliding a file across the table. "Welcome," the officer said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You'll have a special assignment here. It's different from what you've done before. You won't be working alone." He opened the file and froze. The photograph inside showed a green-skinned woman with short orange hair and eyes like polished jade. She wore a tactical vest, her stance straight and confident. Beneath the photo were her service details, combat experience, survival expertise, and a line that read species, classified. His heartbeat quickened as he realized she was not human. "You'll meet her shortly," the officer continued, watching his reaction closely. "She's been assigned as your mission companion. Learn to work with her. The two of you will be heading into territory most won't dare to enter. She knows it better than anyone, and your skills will keep both of you alive." Stepping outside again, he noticed a small group gathered near the vehicle lot. Standing among them was the woman from the file. In person, she was even more striking. Her green skin glowed under the sunlight, and her sharp eyes locked onto him the moment he approached. There was no hesitation in her gaze, only a quiet assessment, as if she were measuring his worth in a single glance. When he reached her, she extended her hand. "I am Kayla," she said simply. Her grip was firm, her voice smooth with a faint accent that hinted at another world entirely. He introduced himself, and for a brief moment, they stood there silently, hand in hand, with the hum of engines and distant shouts of soldiers around them. Something about her presence felt both foreign and familiar at the same time. "Come," Kayla said, turning toward a waiting transport. "We have a briefing to attend. You should know what's ahead before we step into it. The mission is dangerous, but if you follow my lead, we might both return to this base alive." He sat in the transport beside Kayla, the hum of the engine filling the silence between them. Outside the window, the desert blurred into a sea of gold and red, broken only by jagged rocks and the occasional shadow of flying drones passing overhead. She kept her eyes forward, her posture straight, as if the landscape meant nothing to her. He could feel she was focused on something beyond the horizon, something only she understood. The briefing was held in a small, reinforced outpost that seemed older than the rest of the base. A holographic map flickered on the wall, showing an area marked in deep red. "This is where we're going," the commander said, his finger tracing the border of the danger zone. "It's unstable territory. No patrols, no air support, and no rescue teams if things go wrong." The room was filled with the quiet weight of that warning. Kayla stood beside him as the details poured in. Hostile raiders, unpredictable storms, and abandoned alien ruins marked as high-risk zones. She seemed unfazed, as if these were just familiar obstacles in a routine task. He, however, noted every detail with care, already running through survival plans in his head. The map shifted to show an extraction point, and the commander's voice dropped slightly as he added, "You'll be retrieving something important. Classified level. You're not to open it or ask about it until you return." When the meeting ended, Kayla walked ahead without looking back, her boots crunching over the sand. He caught up, matching her pace, and asked what she thought of the mission. She gave a small shrug. It's dangerous, but we'll manage. There was no fear in her tone, only certainty. He realized she had probably faced worse than whatever was waiting for them. Out there, they reached the motor pool where a transport vehicle was being loaded with supplies. Crates of rations, fuel cells, and weapons were stacked neatly, and two mechanics ran last-minute checks on the engine. Kayla moved toward the weapon rack and selected a sleek, alien-made rifle, checking its sights before placing it beside her seat. He chose a standard human-issue rifle, heavier but familiar in his hands. Their choices seemed to reflect their worlds, hers built for precision, his for raw power. Before they set off, Kayla turned to him and said, "I will lead, you will adapt. We survive by understanding each other's ways." He nodded, recognizing it was not arrogance but a statement of how things had to be. The desert was not kind to those who hesitated. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle lurched forward, heading toward the invisible line where safety ended and danger began. The terrain grew harsher as they drove. The sand gave way to rocky stretches that rattled the vehicle, forcing them to slow down. Towering cliffs rose on either side, their shadows stretching long across the path. He scanned for movement, his hand never far from his weapon. Kayla seemed calm, her eyes shifting between the path ahead and the ridges above, as if she expected trouble to come from either direction at any moment. By the time the sun began to sink, the air had cooled, and the desert wind grew sharper. They set up a small camp beside a cluster of rocks that offered some cover. Kayla moved efficiently, laying out sensors and checking the perimeter, while he started a small controlled fire for warmth. When she finally sat across from him, the flicker of the flames cast shifting patterns on her green skin, making her look almost otherworldly. For the first time, she smiled faintly, as if acknowledging that this was the first step into something far more dangerous than the map had shown. At dawn, they broke camp and continued deeper into the restricted zone. The wind carried a faint metallic scent, as if the air itself remembered battles fought long ago. Kayla sat in the passenger seat, her eyes scanning the horizon with quiet precision. He kept his focus on the road ahead, though the path was little more than uneven rock and shifting sand. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but heavy with unspoken awareness of what lay ahead. The first sign of trouble came when the vehicle's sensors detected movement. A warning tone beeped, and Kayla leaned forward to study the display. "3 figures moving fast," she said, her voice calm but firm. He slowed the vehicle, scanning the ridges with his rifle ready. Moments later, 3 raiders on hoverbikes burst from behind a rock formation, weapons drawn and engines screaming. The chase began before either of them spoke another word. Kayla swung her rifle up and fired with sharp, deliberate bursts. The first raider fell, his bike spinning out in a cloud of dust. He swerved hard to avoid incoming fire, gripping the wheel tightly as he maneuvered through narrow gaps between rocks. The second raider closed in on their flank, but a shot from Kayla dropped him before he could pull the trigger. The third turned away, disappearing into the cliffs as quickly as he had appeared. Breathing hard, he brought the vehicle to a stop. Kayla checked the horizon again before lowering her weapon. "They were scouts," she said flatly. "The rest will know we're here now." He nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. They had entered a place where every movement would be noticed and every sound might draw danger. The mission had just become more complicated. They pressed on, now with sharper vigilance. The terrain shifted again, leading them to an expanse of cracked earth, dotted with the ruins of alien structures. Towering spires leaned at odd angles, their surfaces etched with patterns that glowed faintly in the sunlight. Kayla slowed their approach, stepping out of the vehicle to study the markings. Her fingers brushed over the carvings, and for a moment, she looked almost sad. "This was my people's city once," she murmured. "Before the storms and the war, He followed her into the ruins, keeping his weapon ready while she moved. With familiarity through the broken streets, the wind whistled through hollow doorways, carrying whispers of a time long gone. They searched carefully, stepping over debris and ducking beneath fallen beams. At the center of the ruins, they found a sealed chamber door marked with the same symbols as her armor. Kayla knelt and began working on the locking mechanism with quiet determination. The door opened with a low hiss, revealing a chamber lit by a soft blue glow. Inside, rows of metallic crates lined the walls, each marked with unfamiliar insignias. In the center sat a small, reinforced container, its surface pristine despite the decay around it. Kayla approached it slowly, her expression unreadable. "This is it," she said, her voice low. "What they sent us for." She reached out, but before her fingers touched it, the ground shook violently. An explosion tore through one of the outer walls, sending shards of stone and dust into the air. Through the haze, figures in scavenger armor poured into the chamber, weapons blazing. He dropped to cover and returned fire, while Kayla seized the container and moved toward the exit. The air filled with the roar of gunfire and the sharp scent of scorched metal. As they fought their way out, he realized this mission was no longer just about retrieval. It was about survival against enemies who would not stop until they were both dead. They sprinted from the collapsing chamber, the container clutched tightly in Kayla's grip. The heat of the blast still lingered in the air, stinging their skin as they dove behind a fallen pillar for cover. Shouts echoed from the scavengers as they regrouped outside, their boots pounding against the cracked stone. He reloaded quickly, glancing at Kayla, who gave a single nod before leaning out to fire another controlled burst. The scavengers pressed forward, their armor patched together from scraps of different worlds. Blaster fire ricocheted off the surrounding debris, forcing them to move in short bursts from one cover to another. Kayla's movements were sharp and precise, her green skin catching flashes of sunlight as she shifted position. He followed her lead, covering her when she moved, and she returned the favor without hesitation. Every step brought them closer to the vehicle, though the enemy seemed to multiply with each passing moment. A sudden roar from above made them glance upward. One of the scavengers had called an aerial support, a small attack drone that hovered menacingly overhead. Kayla didn't waste time. She switched her rifle to an energy charge mode and fired a single shot that struck the drone's core, sending it crashing into the ruins in a shower of sparks. "Go!" she shouted, breaking into a run. He covered her retreat, his rifle kicking against his shoulder with each shot. They reached the vehicle, diving inside as rounds slammed into the armor plating. The engine roared to life, and he floored the accelerator, kicking up a cloud of dust that swallowed their pursuers. Kayla set the container on the floor between them, keeping one hand on her weapon and the other braced against the dash. Neither spoke for several minutes, the only sound the grinding of tires over rock and the distant echo of enemy fire fading behind them. Once they were a safe distance away, Kayla finally spoke. "They will follow us. They will not stop." Her tone was calm, but there was no mistaking the certainty in her words. He glanced at the container, its surface unmarked despite the chaos it had just endured. Whatever was inside, it was worth enough to risk both their lives. He wanted to ask, but the commander's warning from the briefing echoed in his mind, reminding him that curiosity could be dangerous here. They drove for hours, skirting around deep ravines and weaving through jagged cliffs that shielded them from aerial detection. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the terrain. Kayla checked the navigation screen and pointed to a narrow canyon ahead. "We can rest there for the night. The rock walls will hide our heat signatures." He nodded, adjusting their course. The canyon swallowed them in shadow, the temperature dropping sharply as they parked between two massive stone pillars, while he set up a small perimeter alarm. Kayla inspected the container closely. Her fingers traced its smooth edges, pausing over a series of engraved lines that seemed almost decorative. In the dim light, he caught a flicker of something in her expression, a mix of pride and grief. She set it down gently and took the first watch, her rifle resting across her knees. He settled into his bedroll, the weight of exhaustion pulling at him. Though sleep came slowly in this place, the night was silent except for the occasional whisper of wind through the canyon. Hours passed before Kala's voice broke the stillness. "Your people fight differently," she said without looking at him. "You adapt fast, but you do not rely on instinct the way mine do." He considered her words carefully, realizing that in just a short time, they had already learned to move as one. Whether they trusted each other completely yet was another matter. But out here, trust would decide whether they lived to see the mission's end. The morning came with the pale light of dawn filtering into the canyon. The air was cold, and a thin mist clung to the rocky walls. He rose quietly, packing their gear while Kayla remained alert on watch. She had not slept, and yet there was no sign of fatigue in her eyes. When he glanced toward the container, he saw it resting exactly where she had placed it the night before, untouched and still sealed. They broke camp quickly, knowing the scavengers would be on their trail. The vehicle rumbled to life, and they rolled out of the canyon, heading toward the next waypoint marked on their map. The land ahead was harsher now, a mix of jagged cliffs and narrow passes where one ambush could end the mission. Kayla kept her rifle across her lap, scanning every ridge as if expecting movement at any moment. Her voice was quiet when she finally said, "We will need to pass through the Black Mesa. Few return from there." By midday, the Black Mesa loomed ahead, its sheer cliffs rising like the walls of a fortress. Dark streaks of mineral veins ran through the stone, giving it an almost charred appearance. The wind here howled through the gaps, carrying fine dust that clung to their armor. As they navigated the winding path upward, the vehicle's tires scraped against the loose rock, sending pebbles tumbling into the depths below. Every turn seemed to tighten the walls around them until the sky was just a thin strip overhead. Halfway through, Kayla raised a hand for him to stop. She pointed to fresh tracks in the dust, several sets of boots, and at least one hover bike. "Scavengers or worse," she muttered. They disembarked, moving cautiously on foot, each step measured and silent. The air was tense, the kind of silence that could shatter with the click of a weapon. His pulse quickened, but he kept his focus. Ahead, knowing Kayla's sharp instincts were guiding their pace, the ambush came without warning. Figures emerged from the shadows, their armor painted in streaks of red and black. They fired first, forcing him and Kayla to dive for cover behind a boulder. The confined space amplified every shot, the echoes bouncing from wall to wall. Kayla rolled out to return fire, her shots precise and unhurried, even as rounds sparked against the stone near her head. He provided covering fire, pushing their attackers back just enough to break the encirclement. They moved fast, retreating to the vehicle and powering forward through the narrow pass. One raider on a hover bike gave chase, weaving through the rock with unnerving skill. Kayla leaned out of the passenger side, her hair whipping in the wind, and fired a single shot that sent the bike crashing into the canyon wall. The sound of the explosion faded behind them, replaced by the steady growl of the engine as they left the mesa behind. Once clear, they stopped briefly to catch their breath. The sun was dipping low again, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson. Kayla leaned against the vehicle, her breathing even as she cleaned her rifle. "They will not forgive this," she said simply. He looked out toward the horizon, where the map showed their next checkpoint, an abandoned research station near the edge of the Stormlands. They both knew rest would be short, and the next stretch would test them even further. They drove into the night, the headlights cutting through the darkness as the temperature dropped sharply. The stars above were unfamiliar, their patterns strange compared to those of his homeworld. Kayla watched them for a moment before speaking. My people used to navigate by these stars. Now most of us avoid this sky. There was a quiet sadness in her words, one he did not question. Some truths could wait, but the mission could not, and their journey pressed onward into the unknown. The abandoned research station appeared in the distance as a dark silhouette against the pale morning light. Its tall antenna leaned slightly, battered by years of wind and sand. As they approached, the vehicle's tires crunched over broken glass and scattered metal parts. Kayla stepped out first, scanning the perimeter with her rifle at the ready. The place was quiet, but not in a way that felt safe. It was the kind of stillness that could be broken at any second. They entered through a half-collapsed doorway. The metal frame twisted from some long-past explosion. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint scent of burned circuitry. Dust covered the consoles, and shattered screens hung loosely from their mounts. Kayla moved ahead, checking each room while he followed with his weapon raised. In the control center, a flicker of light from a half-functioning console caught his attention. Against all odds, part of the station was still alive. Kayla accessed the console, her fingers moving quickly over the worn keys. A map of the surrounding region appeared, along with a string of encrypted coordinates. "This is where we deliver the container," she said after a moment. The location was deep within the Stormlands, far beyond any safe route. The air between them seemed to tighten as the reality of their next step settled in. The mission was no longer just dangerous, it was verging on impossible. Before they could leave, movement stirred in the shadows near the far wall. Figures emerged slowly, their faces hidden beneath rebreather masks. They were scavengers, but not like the ones before. These moved with precision, their weapons sleek and well-maintained. One of them spoke through a voice filter, the words carrying a cold certainty. "Hand over the container, and you walk away." Kayla's grip tightened on her rifle, and he felt his own muscles tense in response. The first shot came from the enemy, striking the wall beside Kayla's head. They dropped to cover instantly, returning fire in controlled bursts. The narrow corridors of the station turned into a deadly maze, with shots echoing off every surface. Kayla moved like water, flowing from one position to another, her precision never wavering. He covered her from behind, forcing the attackers to split their focus. Each movement was deliberate, every shot counted. When the last scavenger fell, the air was filled with the acrid smell of discharged weapons. Kayla lowered her rifle slowly, her eyes scanning for any remaining threats. He stepped over to check the bodies, noting their insignia. These were not common raiders, they were organized, perhaps even hired. Whoever wanted the container was willing to send trained fighters into this wasteland to get it. That meant their window to complete the mission was shrinking fast. They didn't waste any more time in the station. Back in the vehicle, Kayla entered the new coordinates into the navigation system. The route flashed red, indicating severe weather and environmental hazards ahead. "The Stormlands will not forgive mistakes," she said without looking at him. He tightened his grip on the wheel, knowing that once they crossed into that territory, turning back would no longer be an option. The hum of the engine became the only sound between them. By midday, dark clouds loomed ahead, churning in slow, menacing spirals. The wind began to howl, carrying with it a fine grit that scraped against their armor. Visibility dropped as they pressed on, the landscape fading into a blur of swirling dust and shadow. Kayla adjusted her breathing mask, her voice cutting through the storm. "Stay close to the ridgeline. It's the only way through without being torn apart." He followed her guidance without question, their path narrowing with every meter they drove. The Stormlands greeted them with an unbroken wall of wind and dust. The sky was hidden behind a roiling mass of clouds that shifted in unnatural patterns, lit from within by flashes of pale blue lightning. The ground was uneven, a patchwork of cracked stone and jagged ridges that forced the vehicle into a slow crawl. Kayla kept one hand braced against the dash, her other holding her rifle across her lap. Every so often she would glance at the scanner, its screen flickering with interference from the storm. They followed the ridgeline as she had instructed, the path twisting and narrowing until there was barely enough room for the vehicle to pass. The wind howled through the gaps in the rock, making the frame of the transport shudder. He gripped the wheel tightly, fighting to keep them steady. Kayla pointed toward a dark cleft ahead, her voice raised over the storm. "Shelter there. We'll wait for the worst to pass." He nodded, steering them toward the narrow opening in the cliff face. Inside the cleft, the roar of the wind dulled slightly, though the sound of grit scraping against metal still filled the air. They parked the vehicle deep inside and shut down the engine to avoid drawing attention. Kayla checked the perimeter, placing small motion sensors near the entrance. He took the chance to drink from his canteen, feeling the grit between his teeth with every swallow. The storm outside raged on, a reminder that time here was not their ally. An hour later, the sensors gave a soft ping. Kayla froze, then moved to the entrance with practiced caution. He followed, weapon ready, peering out into the swirling dust. Shapes moved in the distance low and fast. Not scavengers this time, but something larger. Four-legged creatures, their bodies lean and sinewy, with eyes that glowed faintly through the storm. They moved as a pack, circling the cleft as if they knew prey was inside. Kayla's voice was calm when she said, "Storm hunters." They wait for movement, then strike. They stayed still for several minutes, watching the creature's pace. The fail. Storm made them restless, their tails lashing through the dust. One of them crept closer, sniffing the air near the entrance. Kayla raised her rifle slowly, but before she could fire, the creature let out a sharp, guttural cry. The rest of the pack responded instantly, charging toward the cleft in a blur of teeth and claws. He fired the first shot, the recoil jolting through his arm as the lead hunter fell. Kayla's shots were precise, each one hitting a vital spot. The confined space worked to their advantage, forcing the creatures to funnel through the narrow opening. Still, their strength was immense, and one nearly broke through before Kayla put it down with a clean shot to the head. When the last hunter fell, the wind seemed to ease slightly, as if the storm itself had lost interest in the fight. They stepped over the bodies, checking for any sign of more movement before retreating back inside. Once the threat had passed, they returned to the vehicle and prepared to move again. The storm was beginning to thin, revealing fractured glimpses of the path ahead. Kayla studied the scanner and pointed toward a faint signal in the distance. "That's our drop point. Less than 5 kilometers, but the terrain will be rough." He started the engine, the sound swallowed quickly by the still heavy wind. They eased out of the cleft, pushing forward into the fading storm. As they neared the coordinates, the ground shifted from jagged stone to a plateau of dark glassy rock. In the center stood a structure unlike anything they had seen so far, sleek, unweathered, and pulsing faintly with inner light. It looked untouched by time or storm, as if it had been waiting for them. Kayla's voice was steady when she said, "We found it. This is where the container belongs." They approached the structure cautiously, the sound of their footsteps echoing faintly across the smooth black rock. The pulsing light from within the walls cast an otherworldly glow on Kayla's green skin, making her look almost like a part of the structure itself. He kept his weapon ready, scanning the horizon for any movement. The storm behind them had faded, but the air here felt heavier, charged with an unseen energy that made the hair on his arms stand on end. At the base of the structure, a seamless doorway slid open without a sound, revealing a chamber bathed in soft blue light. Kayla stepped inside first, her boots making no sound on the polished floor. He followed, his eyes drawn to the strange symbols carved into the wall, symbols that matched those on Kayla's armor. In the center of the chamber was a pedestal, its surface smooth and waiting. Kayla turned to him and held out her hands. For the container, he passed it to her without a word, watching as she carried it to the pedestal. The moment it touched the surface, the light in the room brightened and a low hum filled the air. The symbols on the walls began to shift and change, forming patterns that moved like flowing water. Kayla stood perfectly still, her gaze locked on the container as if she were listening to something he could not hear. The hum grew deeper, resonating through the floor beneath their feet. Suddenly, an image appeared in the air above the pedestal, a projection of a city unlike any he had ever seen. Towering spires of crystal, bridges of light, and skies filled with ships that shimmered like stars. Kayla's voice was quiet when she spoke. "This is my home." Or it was, before the war took it from us. Her eyes glistened in the light, but her posture remained strong. He realized then that the mission had never been just about the container. It had been about restoring something she had lost. The projection shifted, showing maps and coded sequences as if the structure itself was offering information. Kayla absorbed every detail, her fingers tracing the air as she interacted with the display. Then the image faded and the hum subsided. The pedestal's surface split open, revealing a smaller object inside, a crystalline sphere that pulsed with the same light as the walls. Kayla lifted it carefully, cradling it in both hands as if it were alive. "This is what I was sent for. This is the key to rebuilding my people's future." Before they could leave, the sound of engines echoed outside. He moved to the doorway and saw a squad of heavily armed figures approaching across the plateau. Their armor bore the same insignia as the trained scavengers they had fought before. "They found us," he said sharply. Kayla glanced at him, then at the sphere in her hands. "Then we make sure they can't take it." Her voice was steady, but her eyes burned with determination. They fought side by side as the attackers closed in. His rifle barked in rapid bursts, while Kayla's precise shots cut down enemies before they could get close. The plateau became a battleground, the light from the structure casting sharp shadows across the rock. The attackers pushed hard, but the two of them moved as one, covering each other's flanks and never letting the enemy gain the upper hand. When the last of them fell, the wind carried away the smell of scorched metal and smoke. With the threat gone, Kayla turned back toward the structure. She placed the sphere back into the container and sealed it once more. "It will be taken to a safe place, far from the reach of those who would use it for war," she said. He nodded, understanding that their mission was complete, but their alliance was far from over. As they walked back to the vehicle, the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, painting the stormlands in gold. In that light, he realized, they had not only survived but forged something unbreakable between them.